Good morning. We're working on Unit 10 today, and we're going to revisit one topic that we were looking at last week, and that is IDEs. And at this point, I hope you guys know what that acronym stands for. But we're also going to look at two additional technologies and acronyms. So this is like acronym city today, right? So I had a different title on this unit, and I decided to change it to kind of tweak to match the content more accurately. And so the topics today are IDEs, VDIs, and VPN. So some of you probably, if you're a full-time student here, already have an IDE, at least one installed on your system that you're using. So the beauty of that is, if you've already done that, you already have one of your assignments complete. Isn't that wonderful? See how kind I am? But the other technologies that we're going to look at are ones that maybe you've heard alluded to in your other classes. Perhaps you've already used the technology, or perhaps you haven't even heard of it at all. And I know that when you first start out in the program, especially at the beginning of the semester, you just get inundated. It's like, oh my God, I got to log into this and log into that, and I got passwords for this, and there's a different system and a different web address, and oh my God, I know how I felt when I first started working here. I was overwhelmed by it, and I'm a technology person, I'm like, all right, I'm on board. How many systems do I have to log into? How many passwords? Oh my God, I was like really kind of blown away by it all. But the technologies that you see listed here are ones, if you're in the web program, you're going to run into constantly, right? To varying degrees depending on what you're doing in particular. And I'm going to go through each one of these and kind of explain the relevance and how it pertains to whatever you're doing. So we already talked about IDE, so I'm actually going to circle back to that last because I feel like, we talked, I thought we had a really good discussion last week about it, but I want to talk about why these other technologies are important. So I have this little blurb in here, and it says, why do I need to know this stuff? Well, if you're taking like the Python class with me this semester, you're taking Java with Christian or Christopher, you guys know that if you're coding, you have to have the tools to do the work. And in many cases, there's more than one tool you can use. And it really, we don't really coerce particular pieces of software, but we certainly have favorites as instructors. So like as we kind of favorite stuff, that's what we kind of show you. And then what I think is really kind of healthy is when you take classes with different people and they're teaching you the same technology, but they're using different tools. And then you see how that person uses their tool and how a different person uses their tool, and it kind of gives you a little wider perspective on how to approach solving problems working with technology. But here's the crux of this. If you're working on your own equipment at home, you're not sitting in front of the same kind of machines that you're sitting here in the labs. Now, these machines are already pushing 3 years old, but they are i7s with multiple cores running at a really fast speed, 32 gigs of RAM, and solid state, I think 500 gig hard drives. By all intents and purposes, we call these workstations. It means that they're a little more powerful than a consumer grade machine, and are really intended to do a lot more processing and performance related things, because you really kind of need that when you start coding, especially when you start to get like many programs open all at once. If you open up like your IDEs, the ones that you might already be using, so like my Python students, you'll be using Spider typically. When you launch that, you ever count how long it takes to launch, even on a fast computer? It's really slow.
A lot of open and close.
Why? Because it's not Notepad, folks. It's a much more powerful piece of software. Microsoft Word looks like a speed demon in compared to an IDE when you launch it. And that's I think it's kind of interesting, but it shows you how big and robust those pieces of software are. They take up a lot of disk space, they take up a lot of processing power, because you're doing powerful things with it. You're really using powerful tools. The problem is sometimes at home, you guys will not have equipment that matches up what we're using here at school. You might go out and buy that, like, even $1,000 laptop and find that you're hitting performance limits right when you buy it brand new, because it's not really it doesn't really have enough RAM. 8 gigs of RAM, folks, really, honestly, for a coder is like not even close to enough. 16 gigs at this point, I think, is a bare minimum. Unfortunately, when you walk into a store, 4 gigs or 8 gigs is the most common, right? Because really what they want you to do is run out and buy memory after, because then they get more money out of you. See, if you're smart, you order your machine online, right? And then order it with the amount of RAM that you want, and then you don't overpay for your RAM by having to replace what's already there. I think that's always a smart strategy. But here's the thing. So you guys go home, and even if you have a nice machine at home, maybe that nice machine that you have doesn't have the biggest hard drive. And then you'll jump into like a third semester class like ASP.NET, which you'll likely take with me. And I'm like, well, you must have Visual Studio to do your work. Must. There's no other tool we can really use. And all of a sudden you install all the little plugins and doodads that go with it. And I think the base level install I need for you guys to do your work in that class is somewhere around 60 gigs of disk storage. And if you're working on a 250 gig drive and you've already got your Call of Duty and your Battlefield and your Fortnite and all that stuff loaded up, chances are your drive's already full. So either you're looking at a second hard drive or a bigger hard drive, or like, I can't load this. I just, I can't give up my Battlefield, so I have to do something, right? So what we end up doing for people who are not only don't have the grade of equipment that they need, or, and I'm not going to say worse yet, but alternately might own like a Macintosh. And you get to like some of our classes, like the .NET courses, if you're loading Visual Studio, they do make a version of Visual Studio for the Mac, but it has none of the tools that we need to do ASP.NET work. The libraries don't exist on a Mac yet. I think it's going to change. And I think Microsoft's working on it. So you're forced then as a Macintosh user to either run what they call a virtual environment, where you run Windows on your machine, like inside of a window, and then load your stuff into there, very performance intensive. Or some Mac users will go as far as creating a dual boot, so they can either boot to Mac or boot to Windows. Mac users can do that, PC people can't. We can't boot to a Mac OS on our machines.
Well, you could though, like if you had like that separate operating.
It's really challenging to boot a Mac operating system on a PC. There are people that do what they call Hackintosh and run it as a virtual machine. So if like you're, and there's tutorials and stuff out there, but it is kind of a pain to do. And frankly, depending on the kind of development work you do, anything that's Windows related or Microsoft technology related is almost always done on a PC, unfortunately. A lot of web work though, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, Java, a lot of the technologies you can learn them just fine and do them just fine on a Mac. And in fact, in some cases, I might argue a little better. And that's just an opinion, mind you. I tend to be a multi-platform person, so I'm not really tied to one particular operating system or approach. I have both Macs and PCs, and I use them fairly equally. And if you ask me if I had enough money to go buy like any computer I wanted next, I'd probably get a Mac. And a lot of people I work with are like, why would you do that? But I also need a PC. So I would actually try to get a PC and a Mac. That's just how I operate, because I love both platforms for very different reasons, but both are very good. All right, but let's say you're in that situation where you're technology challenged, you don't have the equipment you need to really do the work. But you still need to do the work, and you can't be driving to campus all the time to do it. We have what we call the VDI here at Gateway, and I have a whole breakdown here of how to work with it. So this little posting inside of here is kind of a combination tutorial and introduction to the environment. And I'm going to be jumping into this in just a moment. And you can feel free to go ahead and click the link if you're curious. But let me talk first about what a virtual desktop interface is. A VDI is basically what we call a virtual machine. A virtual machine is a simulation of a computer system. Okay, so that's kind of an odd concept if you've never encountered the thought. So what that means is I take some other computer and I connect to an environment that looks like a full computer system that's running somewhere else. All we're doing is using whatever machine we have in front of us, and it can even be a Chromebook, where typically we wouldn't be able to load any of the software. And through a web interface, you connect to this remote server that has basically a virtual hard drive that you log into, that boots up like a regular computer. You connect, and inside that environment is a complete Windows 10 operating system with all the same software loaded as you have on all these lab computers sitting in front of you. You didn't have to install any of it. You don't have to update any of it. You don't have to back any of it up, configure any of it. You just log in, use it, and do your work. It is really cool. Now here's the fascinating thing about this. You would be amazed at people that work out in industry. So if like people like walk into their corporate office complex and they sit down at their desk and they log into their machine, 9 times out of 10, those corporate office drones are using virtual desktops and environments. They're not really using software on their machine. They're just using their machine as a portal to control an environment. And the reason they do this is because it provides centralized control for the admins and complete failover backup. So this is kind of fascinating. There are organizations, right, that operate completely with these virtual environments. And what happens if like they have a power outage where they're working? Or a bomb drops, or the internet connection is severed. You know, like everybody stops working. But the beauty is because all the desktops are actually loaded on servers somewhere else, often not even in the same building, maybe even hundreds or thousands of miles away, that's the mind-boggling part of it, they can move to what they call a cold site, and there's lots of these around, usually at like data centers and backup locations, where you can walk in, you can transfer all your stuff over to, including your phones, all your screens, it's all on a server somewhere, so all I have to do is sit down to a different machine, get connected up to the same resources, and boom, all your stuff is there, just like you picked up the whole office and moved somewhere else magically. All right, so even if you don't use this to do academic work, it's really kind of good to be introduced to the whole concept. And so what I'm doing here is I'm clicking on this link, and the link is basically nimbus.gtc.edu. And if you guys are familiar with what Nimbus is a cloud type, like cumulonimbus, right? Yeah, and you know what? They sometimes change these server names. Or right now we're operating on the Nimbus machine, which indicates a cloud. So it's like this is cloud computing, folks, is what it is. So you hear about the cloud, and here's an example of it. So I'm just going to my browser here. I'm connecting to a server here at Gateway that runs these virtual machines. VMware, the company whose software we're using to do this, their whole business is virtualization. So they run operating systems that run other operating systems. So what you're going to do here is you're actually going to use this bottom link to connect. It's going to take you to a screen where you log in. So before you log in, if you already have, whatever, I'm not going to stop you. But before you log in, I just want to tell you that at the beginning of each semester, your instructors, and I don't know how regular everybody is about doing this, we put in requests, and I usually do this after the first week, so I wait to see who's registered first, because sometimes people add late or drop or whatever those first weeks. And by the second week, I put in a request with our tech support department to create both VDI accounts and VPN accounts. And I did that at the beginning of the semester, so anybody who was registered when we first started will automatically have one of these accounts, or you should. To log in, you use the same login credentials that you use to log in to Blackboard, your email, which usually is like your student ID and password. So I'm going to go ahead and log into mine using my user ID and password. If I can remember how to type it. And then go ahead and click login. From there, you're going to be transported to this screen. This screen is kind of the online version of what they call the Horizon client. The client works through the browser, so we don't need to install any software. This is why I really love this approach. And it gives us access to the virtual environment. For some students, depending on what program you're logged into, so like if you were in the networking program or cybersecurity or the software developer program, they actually have multiple VDIs that they use. We only have one, right? And so you only should have one on your screen. If you have more than one, it's probably because you're in a different program also. So just go ahead and click that icon, and then what it's going to do is it's going to go into your personalized virtual desktop, and see what it's doing right now is it's launching that virtual machine. So I'm booting Windows inside of my browser, folks. Isn't that groovy? I think so. I mean, the first time I ever did this, I'm like, wow, this is cool. You know, I really had that kind of reaction. It really kind of blew my mind that that was even a possibility. It is a little sluggish if you don't use it a lot. So for all of you that are just doing it probably for the first time, the initial boot might take a little while. Because it's kind of like starting a brand new computer. You know, so you see how like it's saying preparing Windows, like you've never even booted the machine before. So we're just letting it do its thing. We're being patient and giving it a minute. But it is basically booting this virtual machine that is then basically on a remote server, and then that is just sending an image back to your screen that allows you to remote control that computer using your keyboard and mouse, just like you do your local machine. So I'm going to give this just a moment to do this, but I want to go back to the page or our course shell here and just show you that I have instructions. So if you forget how to do this, I have a complete set of them here. And I do recommend, you notice on that one screen there were two options for connecting. The one option is going through your browser, and the other option is actually loading the client software. In the past, I would never use the web interface because it was really clunky and I didn't think it worked too well. And so I'd always load the client software. These days, I think the web interface works so well that I don't think you really need to do that. Because if you do download the client software, it's about a 200 meg download, which means after you unzip everything and install it, it's probably like close to half a gig, and that's a lot of hard drive space. And so if you want to save the hard drive space in particular, I wouldn't do the install. If you have plenty of disk space, I mean, frankly, I think the user experience with the client is a little smoother and richer. It just seems a little more stable overall, especially on a high-speed connection. But, you know, that's functionally the difference. So this one installs a piece of software, and then you use that piece of software to connect to the VDI. But I think it's so easy to go through the browser, why would you even bother to install the software? You know, that's kind of my thinking these days. Here's a little shot of the login screen, just so you guys are familiar. A little snapshot of the overview of the VDIs, and we already were there. And then once you get logged in, you end up in an environment like this. So I'm hoping that when I switch back, you'll see that I have this on the screen. John?
The error message.
Yeah, just click OK. Basically, what this is telling you, and this is kind of like the, remember that movie Inception, where they had like the dream within the dream within the dream? Here's the scary part of virtualization. This environment that's running inside my browser right now is a virtual desktop environment. You can also configure these to run other virtual environments inside of themselves. Yeah. But you notice what they've done on the gateway servers, they're saying that virtualization is disabled, so they're not letting you run other virtual environments inside of here. They've got that feature turned off. But it does give you the idea that if it wasn't turned off, you mean I could run a virtual desktop that was running a virtual desktop? Here's the freaky thing. When you connect to stuff out on the internet, when you connect to servers, any servers in most corporations, that's how it's all done. Everything is virtualized. Because the reason they do that is this whole environment boils down to one single file on a server. So when your whole environment is one file, it makes it really easy to back it up to copy it, to move it, to change it, to delete it, to upgrade it, all that stuff, it just makes it a lot easier. It also kind of isolates things because this is a virtual environment. It doesn't necessarily have the ability to do what the desktops in front of you do, which is, like if you got a virus on one of these desktops and it started to propagate, it could propagate out to the whole network, where here it's a lot more isolated and easier to control and frankly just flip a switch and turn it off. That's kind of interesting. So, I mean, you see right now, and this is a little confusing because, you know, I have two start menus, you know, and two Windows environments. And so if you're running the VDI, what I sometimes suggest to you is that you do this. Go up to your browser options here and switch yourself to full screen mode. And then when you get in full screen mode, and provided you have a good high-speed connection in both directions, you kind of can't even tell that you're remote controlling a machine. So those office drones that I was talking about, right, where they log into their machines in the morning, they get into their virtual environments, they don't even know they're in a virtual environment. That's the scary thing. They don't even get it. They don't understand that they're working inside of a dream, right? You know, that, and I think that's really kind of an interesting analogy. So here I have this environment, right? And it looks like this is probably more updated than the desktop sitting in front of you. But if you start to poke around, I mean, right away you see your browsers are, you know, there. If you're working in Java class, good chance you're already using like JGrasp or whatever. But you can come down to the start menu. And I will tell you, like, when you first start using it, it can be a little slow because I already clicked on the start menu and it's not quite responding yet. Takes a little while for it to kind of, it's kind of like, you know, warming up an old car in the winter or something. But once the environment gets chugging, it actually works pretty well. But what's neat about it is all the tools that we use in the program, everything. You know, all the IDEs are preloaded. NetBeans is in there, Eclipse is in there, Visual Studio's in there, JGrasp, a bunch of image editors, FTP software. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on and on. And so when you have this capability available to you, it really kind of allows you to do stuff that you could not possibly do in other scenarios. So one possibility is this. You can't afford to buy a regular laptop and you're sitting there working at home with a Chromebook, right? Now, you guys should know in the web program and the software program both, we technically require you to have a laptop with certain capabilities to do the work. But we know that often that people can't afford it right away, so VDI sometimes becomes your only option for getting your work done, especially if you don't have high-quality equipment at home. And it's probably the #1 reason people use the environment. Like, oh, wow, I'm using a Chromebook, and I need Visual Studio. Like, that's not even possible. Right, okay, yeah, it's not even possible. Which is one of the reasons why, you know, as a developer, you really don't want to be working on a Chromebook, generally speaking. This is being really, you know, particularly sluggish right now, and I'm not really quite sure why. So I'm trying to get something up on the screen. Is everybody else having that same, is it really, really slow for you guys?
Yeah.
Mine's opening JGrasp.
Okay, well, there it is, okay. All right, but if you're in the environment, though, I'm going to go ahead and just go ahead and launch Visual Studio here. So they have Visual Studio 2017 installed, and I'm going to let the environment launch so you can see what it looks like in here. But I have to give you a couple of tips about this environment. This is a virtual environment. When you are done working in it, what you should do is go down to the Start menu and choose Shutdown, right, to turn it off, so it's not consuming resources on the server. The other thing you should know is if you're working in here and you need to save a file, what do you do? Right?
I couldn't get into that. I've got experimental while we were waiting, and it kind of doesn't give you that option. At least it appeared it didn't.
Yeah, in fact, if you save something in here, it might be there when you come back, but it might not. And what I've been told by the text is, you know, don't tell your students that it's a persistent environment, because if we do upgrades, it'll wipe all their files. And you know how often they do upgrades for Windows? It seems like every other week these days, right? So don't save your files inside this environment. So what you do instead, folks, is you go to your cloud drive inside the environment. So if you were you know, doing whatever programming work and then you go to save your file, then take that file and drop it into your Google Drive inside this environment. So go log into your email, go to your Google Drive, drop your files in the folder, and you're good. All right. So Visual Studio is finally launching. It is being very, very slow, and I don't know if it's because we have a whole bunch of people using it all at the same time. I'm not really sure why it's so sluggish. So I'm not sure if the client is quite as sluggish as this, but you guys can experiment with that on your own. But I think it's kind of interesting to note that. The other thing that's kind of fascinating, and I'm trying to open up a file window here. Yeah, it's going pretty darn slow. It's not really a good selling point, right? All right, so I opened up a file window here, and I do want to point out that if you open up, the file manager and take a look inside of this PC, you're going to notice that there's 2 network directories listed under this PC. And I'm just going to kind of mention what those are. So one is your simulated hard drive. All right, so you have a virtual hard drive, and like I said, you can store files here, but they might be gone the next time you come back. I'm just telling you. And in fact, what I could do is I could look in my document folder and see if anything that I put there is still there. No, okay, it's not. All right, just like I expected. But then you also have these 2 entries, and you guys might not have this one. Do you guys have, I don't know, if you do, that one, the W drive is the one that is shared across the campus. And I don't think students get that one. I think only faculty and staff get it, so like where we store shared files for the whole organization. I typically don't use these drives at all, but all of us should have what we call an H drive or a home directory, which is located on the network server, and stuff that you put in here actually will persist between sessions. However, I'm still not a fan of putting stuff here, so I have stuff in here that dates back to when I first started at Gateway, and if you look at all the file dates, I was using it a lot when I first started back in early 2014, and then I kind of just like left it alone, but all the stuff is still there. So if you don't want to connect to your cloud, storage inside, let's say you don't want to connect to Google Drive inside of here, you could put it in your H drive. The only problem is the only way you're going to get the files back is to log back into the VDI and pull them in. That's the only issue. So I much prefer that you use your cloud storage. If you use your external drive, so if you're using a flash drive or something, then you actually want to use the client software, because the client software does allow you to put like a flash drive in your machine and then write files from the VDI directly to the flash drive. Not a fan of that approach either, though. I've seen a lot of people have issues with it in so many different ways. I can't even name them all. So my strong suggestion for you guys is this: when you're working in this environment, save the stuff to the local drive and then transfer it into whatever cloud storage you're using. Google Drive, Dropbox, OneDrive, whatever. There's many of those types of services, and you might have multiple ones. So whichever one works best. In my mind, it's like you just log into your email account, use your Google Drive, it's attached to your student account. To me, it's a no-brainer to use Google Drive for school. That's my preference. Now with Visual Studio, you notice I'm getting a sign-in screen. So if you want to sign into Visual Studio, if you get prompted with that, use the same account information that you use to log into Office 365. So whatever username or password you use for that, that's the best thing to use. And this is treating it like I've never run Visual Studio before. And you know what, that's not really the best setup. They should have like actually finished the setup. So now I'm being critical of our IT people. So it's like if I was their boss, I would make them finish this, because this to me looks like an incomplete setup. It's like you install a piece of software, but you should go back in and run it once and configure it, and then that way when you come back it just launches. And right now it's kind of like building out the whole thing. That's one of the reasons it's taking so long. So that's just kind of a critique on our part. So here's Visual Studio loading up inside the VDI. Pretty darn exciting, right? Right. All right. I'm going to let this, just pretend like this all succeeded and went well, but here is the VDI, folks. It's a backup mechanism to do your work. For some people, it might end up being a primary mechanism to do your work. But just know that it's there. There are some classes that you take at times and some teachers that you'll work with that will actually make you do work in these environments on purpose for very specific reasons. My general approach is I try to stay away from this. I think you're better off working on your local machine always if you can. But if you don't have options and you have crappy equipment, frankly, this is an option. All right, I'm going to come out of full screen, and then I'm going to switch over and talk about one other piece of technology that you probably have not heard about yet, and that's a thing called VPN. VPN is a technology, and that acronym stands for Virtual Private Network. So what this means is this technology allows you to create a network, a secure network connection from one place to another for whatever reason. So I know that, for example, some of you might know VPN, especially younger people. Like if you're in high school and they like lock down your Wi-Fi, you can't even go to like YouTube. They get crafty and they load VPN software so they can what they call tunnel out to the real world and actually get on YouTube and look at a silly like meme video or something. But here at Gateway, if you need to connect to any resources on campus that are not accessible outside of our network, you can use the VPN software to basically load up a connection to Gateway. Your machine then will have a Gateway IP address, and then you can access localized resources that are otherwise not accessible at all. So I can't give you too many examples of that because you guys haven't gotten to the point where you need it. But for example, in the old days, if we wanted to connect to the VDI, you were required to use VPN first. Oh my God, that was a nightmare. Now they have it set up so that you don't need the VPN at all to connect off campus to the VDI. The connection stream for that is already secured. Situations where you will need to connect to the VPN, for example, if I want to work with Apollo, now you guys have been working with Apollo, you bring up your FileZilla and you FTP your files and you're all happy and you see it on the browser, right? But if I wanted to log in to FileZilla from, let's say, a command prompt, yeah, you can do that. So because it's a Linux system, I can log in to Apollo like this. See if I remember my password now. So now I'm logged into Apollo. Okay, so Apollo is a Linux system without a graphical user interface. It's a command line computer system. And now that I'm logged into the prompt, you know what? I can do all sorts of stuff. I can run software. I can write Python scripts at the command prompt, believe it or not. I can run programs, change my password.
But so, like VPNs, that's like what people use to like read like on the dark web, right?
Sometimes,
Okay.
yeah. People use VPNs to obscure their network traffic. Now, the reason Gateway requires you to connect to VPN before you connect to something like this is because if you're a crafty hacker type, if you can get to a command line interface of a computer system, you're one step closer to hacking it. Yeah. Don't get any ideas. No, I have had students try, and I actually have had a couple succeed in cracking into Apollo, believe it or not. And you know what? It was our bad because we didn't have certain stuff locked down. But the truth is, you come in here to do stuff that you can't normally do otherwise. And the whats and whys and hows will really depend on the class you take. Probably the first time you'll need to come into like a command line interface is when you take your PHP class and you have to come in here and configure your databases. And while you can configure the databases graphically, you can also do it all from a command line. And I often get students ask, how do I change my password on Apollo without telling you what it is, Well, you can, if you know how to log into this interface, you can get to the command prompt. You just have to know the right Linux command to change your password. And I could go in here and demonstrate like Unix commands now, and if you want, but that's not the point of this. This is one example of a tool that you can connect to. Another example of a tool that you can connect to if you have a VPN connection is our PHP Myadmin software, which runs on Apollo. That is the graphical front end for the MySQL database server, right? When you guys take your databases class next semester, depending on who you take it with, you'll primarily work with a product called SQL Server for doing your database work. But some of us, and I'm one of those, will also have you work in this environment so that you're familiar with it. And then when you get to your PHP classes, you know, the first class you touch databases at the end, but when you get to the second class, you're like databases all in. When you guys take your Java 1 class, you might do a little database work. But when you get to Java 2, the second half of the class is like mostly database work, you know, because that's like real application development is based upon connecting usually to external databases that connect to a local application. So one other reason why you might use a connection like this, I'm trying to remember my password here to see if that's right, is to be able to allow your application to talk to your database on Apollo. So you're sitting at home creating a Java application that's got a database connection, but that database connection requires VPN to work, right? There are people too that, like those remote desktops that I was bringing up, sometimes they have the capability to VPN into their workplace to retrieve files that they can't retrieve unless they're on their network, or to print documents that they can't print when they're somewhere else. And like I said, you know, yeah, a lot of people use VPN to connect to the dark web or to illegally download files or tunnel out of their high school Wi-Fi. You know, and that, you know, for as funny as that sounds, it's like kids know more about VPN than adults do, because I know how it is at school. Like I know my son's school that when he first started there, they had Wi-Fi open. And then after a while, they realized that the kids are like killing the network and not doing any of their work. And so they shut it off except in the lunchroom during lunchtime, right? And the kids don't want to burn their cell data, right? And so they would get clever and run VPNs to get around all of it, you know? But yeah, so that's what VPN allows you to do. When you do choose to install that VPN software, I have instructions here. There's actually a document attached to the top here. See this? VPN connection PDF. If you're going to configure your laptop to do VPN work, my advice is this. If you make that initial connection, bring your laptop to campus, set up the software on campus, because it's a whole lot easier to do. And then you'll end up with a little piece of software that runs in your system tray that looks like this. It's called Cisco Anyconnect Secure Mobility Client. Now, this is something that's pretty important to know. Gateway, unlike a lot of other places that use VPN to access certain resources, absolutely requires this specific piece of VPN software in order to connect to our network. Some people who provision VPN will allow you to use any VPN software. And the truth is, major operating systems and phones and you know, Windows, the Mac OS, they all have VPN software already built in. And for a lot of services, you just, you know, tell it what you're connecting to and it just works. But with Gateway, you have to use this particular client. And then, so if I was at home and I wanted to connect to the command line like I did, or to the database like I did, I would have to do this connection first, and then it would prompt me for username and password. The other reason that you might use this piece of software if you're on campus is because you're not connected to the wireless network like I am. You're connected to the guest network. And the guest network is physically isolated from the wireless network. It's kind of like being at home. Guests can use it, but they can't access any of our stuff. So if you happen to be on the guest network, you might have to VPN to some of the resources on campus to make it work. Which also tells you that you don't want to be on the guest network while you're on campus. You want to be on wireless. GTC wireless is where you want to be. And that, to get onto that, of course, you need your username and password to get onto it. All right, so I hope that helps clarify those things. So one of your assignments, John, question?
This, the section we're working on, I don't think it has the black
Oh, really? What aren't you seeing?
It's,
All right, well, the students were pointing out that this posting that I have in Unit 10 was actually turned off, so none of them were seeing it, so no wonder they were all giving me strange looks. All right, so there it is. But, okay, once again, instructions for the VDI and how to connect up or download the client, and then also instructions for connecting to the VPN right here. So one of your assignments then, folks, is to actually just connect to the VDI. And if you guys have already done it and you still have it running on your screen, don't be in full screen mode, right? Be like zoomed out. Take a snapshot of that. And that's one of your assignments. It's pretty easy. I just want to see that you actually made the attempt to connect and that you know it's there. That's worth 2 points, by the way. All right. The next assignment is to actually go ahead and install an IDE. And my predecessor that helped put together this course shell, I just kind of kept this assignment that she put in here, and she suggested 3 IDEs, and some of which you may already be using. So the kind of the point here is, whatever IDEs you're already using, whether you're using Spider for Python or Eclipse or JGrasp or Visual Studio Code or Brackets or whatever, right? And we're talking a full integrated environment, we want to see that you've installed one. If you want to really get a jump start for next semester or down the road, and you want to go for the granddaddy IDE install, you want to install Visual Studio, the full Visual Studio product. And I have a set of instructions here, and I do have a little caveat up at the top that says you really don't need it for this class, and technically you probably won't need it for next semester either. It's when you get to 3rd semester where you really need this product. However, I will tell you, any of you that are going to be taking the JavaScript class, for example, I would suggest that you use Visual Studio as your IDE over some of the others, and your instructors might differ with that. But the reason I would use Visual Studio as an IDE for JavaScript is because its IntelliSense for JavaScript and its debugging for JavaScript are second to none. They really are very excellent tools that are built in. It also is excellent at working on web content. So it doesn't do some of the stuff that Dreamweaver does, where it gives you like the real web browser view of what your content looks like inside the product, but it does have really good development tools for accelerating workflow. Great, code highlighting, underlining, autocomplete, really neat little things. And when you see the magic of how it works, you usually get a few oohs and ahs the first time, and then you're like, oh, I see why people use this. But it is not a product for lightweight machines. So if you don't have 8 gigs of RAM, if you have a really slow processor, so I might even consider an i5 a slow processor for Visual Studio, just so you know, especially if it's an older one. If it's like 2 gigahertz and above, you're probably fine, but you want a machine that's got some horsepower and some disk space. If you're one of those people that does install the product, one mistake that people will make on their first install is like, I'm going to install everything. And if you do that, prepare for at least 100 gigabytes of hard disk space being consumed. At least. That's a lot. And for most consumer machines these days, where you buy something off the shelf and you got a 250 gig SSD, that's half your hard drive. So you got to proceed cautiously. What I've done here is I've given you a complete breakdown of where to get the product, how to get it, how to download it, how to install it, tips on usage, and you can read through this. And this is kind of a standard posting I put in any of my courses that require this product. So, all of my students that are learning anything .NET or anything Microsoft go through this install process. So if you don't do it now, you can do it in the future. But I do have a little listing at the bottom here of the tools that I recommend that you install if you do install Visual Studio. This selection, I think, results in an install that's about 40 gigabytes in size. So just keep that in mind. If you end up taking, you make it all the way through the program, if you're doing the 2-year degree, and take the mobile development class, you'll also use it in there. If you are taking game programming, you'll use Visual Studio. So some people take the gaming certificate. If you are also in the software developer program, they use this product very extensively in that program to do their coding. Predominantly for any of the introductory languages like C# and graphical Windows programming. But really a powerful environment. Definitely what I would call kind of like the granddaddy IDE in terms of, if I was to select the one best IDE, this is it, folks. And I think I said that last week. You don't have to install this one, but I just wanted to let you know that there's a complete set of instructions here to help guide you. If I were you and I wanted to just get these assignments done with quickly, if you're already connected to the VDI, great. Just don't be full screen. Take a screenshot, you're pretty much done. And then the same thing with an IDE. If you already have one installed, screenshot that, show me it running on your screen. Just follow the instructions there. You don't have to install the ones that are listed. So if you have something else and you just want to experiment with something else, go for it. I mean, it's not going to hurt anything. And honestly, it'll take a little bit of time until you find, that right hammer that matches like whatever you feel like doing, There's no one right tool. Well, in .NET, Visual Studio is the one right tool. But like if you're doing Java work or any open source coding, there's so many tools, it's mind-boggling, and it's kind of hard to like figure out what to choose and pick and decide upon.
Like a photo editor.
That's not a bad comparison really. But like for Java in particular, you get these very strong mindsets. You got the Eclipse camp and you got the NetBeans camp, and now there's this other, there's many other IDEs too, but there's the IntelliJ camp now too, where a lot of people are kind of migrating from both of those over to IntelliJ. All right, folks, that kind of wraps the lecture for today. It kind of covers all the things that I wanted to talk about. I know it's a lot to wrap your head around, but these assignments are actually quite simple. And if I were you, I would try to finish them before I walked out of the room. And that way you don't have to worry about it over the weekend or next week. But you do have a good week or so to finish it. All right, video ends here, and class is done.